Hey guys, so were you like me, felt compelled to get into manual mode and stay there? Didn't really consider these other modes too much because manual mode was where it was all happening, right? Well, look, I've been doing a little bit of research and it turns out it's not all what it seems to be. So let me just premise this video by saying this is going to be a very simplistic look at these different camera modes that's available to us. I don't want to do a deep technical dive into these modes because for one, that's going to make the video really long. And for two, there's copious amounts of videos on YouTube doing a deep dive. But this video is targeted at someone that's starting out, that wants to get out of auto mode and just wants a brief sort of an overview as to what these camera modes entail. So when faced with photography and specific situations in photography, we need to be au fait with and all over our tools or our settings that is available to us. So after I've run through all these modes, right at the end of the video, I'm going to talk about another setting which will come in very, very handy as a complement to these modes. So please make sure you stick around for that tip. So on the top of our camera here, we've got our mode dial. Now, our mode dial has an auto mode, and there's a variation of these depending on the camera you got, but they typically go like this. There's an auto mode, program mode, full manual mode, and then either aperture a priority or shutter speed priority. Like I said, there are variations of these depending on the camera that you've got, but that's typically the main modes these dials and cameras would cover. So before I get into covering these modes individually, I think it's important to premise the video with what the objective is of these modes. Right? It is to cover one aspect of photography, which is the exposure. Exposure consists of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. How we manipulate that dial into any of these modes, it is to assist us get to the right exposure. Now we've all been there, we've all started in auto mode. What auto mode is effectively, it's an automatic mode where the camera sets the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO depending on the scene it is looking at. Right? It'll make all those assessments based on what's coming into the sensor. Now this may not necessarily be the right settings because the camera lacks certain information. For example, is the subject stationary or is the subject moving? Does the photographer want the front foreground in focus or background? The camera does not know. So auto mode may be fine for certain situations, certain people, but if we want to start tweaking either that aperture, shutter speed, or ISO, then we need to consider these other modes. Now I'd like to start off with, we've covered sort of auto mode. There's another mode called P mode, which is program mode. And program mode allows us to choose one, like we can choose the aperture setting, for example, and the camera will adjust the shutter speed. Or we can adjust the shutter speed and the camera will adjust the aperture. Right? We have the option of putting it into auto ISO, or we can set the ISO at a base level. So program mode kind of runs similar to auto mode, but giving us a little bit of control of one of those parameters, and the camera will choose the other. So the complete opposite to auto mode or program mode is manual mode, where we've got complete total control of the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. Gives us the most control out of all of these modes. But it may not be the best mode to choose. And you'll see why when I run through the following two modes. So as we've learned in previous videos, that aperture controls depth of field, right? And shutter speed captures movement or slow things down. So depending on what it is we are, or what is our subject, what it is we photographing, one of those two things may take preference. So if we're in a particular scenario where aperture is the overriding setting that governs all, example, we got a portrait shoot, our subject is the most important thing, we can then choose aperture. The camera is now going to choose the shutter speed. Shutter speed is not really relevant to us at that juncture. We've got it on a tripod. We've going to be mitigating camera shake as much as possible. But we really want to make sure our aperture is right, because we want our subject in focus and we want our background blurry. Aperture is the priority. It then makes sense to put the camera into aperture priority. In addition to that, and this is dependent on the situation, we could choose auto ISO or a base ISO depending on the lighting conditions, giving us further flexibility if it is in auto ISO. And like I said, there's a caveat there, only in certain situations. So as you can see, with aperture priority, it'll make life a lot easier for us getting to that mode, using that mode for that particular style of photography. Now, similar scenario to aperture, we may be in an environment or situation where shutter speed is the predominant setting that we need to nail. For example, I took these photos of airplanes flying by last year at an air show here on the Gold Coast. Now, as you can well imagine, these planes are flying at a hell of a speed, right? I needed to use a very, very short, fast shutter speed to capture the planes as they came past. So for me, being in manual mode wasn't really ideal. It had to be shutter speed being the prevalent setting. Didn't care what the aperture, what the camera did with aperture. It was in the daytime, so I had a base ISO of 200, so we were all good there. So once again, as you can see, the situation sort of drives what mode we put the camera into. And even the professionals will use these aperture and shutter speed modes. So I touched on this before. We still have ISO as a setting to adjust in conjunction to these other modes that we have available. So don't forget about the ISO settings. Like I said, in some of these modes, you could have it in auto, and some of these modes you could have a base ISO preset to whatever you feel the situation warrants. So keep in mind the availability of setting ISO. So I touched on it earlier, and we can, especially in the beginning as amateurs, we want to try and get to what it is the pros are doing as quickly as possible. And the pros don't stay in manual mode. Absolutely not. The pros understand the value of the different tools and the different settings in this camera, and they use it wisely to get to those settings very, very quickly. That's what a pro does. He knows his tools, he knows the situation, and he gets to those settings quickly. So let's not make life difficult for ourselves by staying in manual mode. Manual mode has its place if we've got time and we've got, landscapes, and we got all the time in the world to set up our scene. Absolutely, manual mode, nothing wrong with it. But there are instances on safari, like I said, these air shows, things are happening relatively quickly, and we don't have the luxury of time. That is when we need to start thinking about using these other modes to assist us quickly get to that all-important exposure setting. So I mentioned another little tool or setting that we can use at the beginning of this video. I mentioned it. We've got a lot of modes available to us. We've got aperture we can set, shutter speed, ISO and all that, plus, like I said, all these different modes. In addition to that there is a setting called exposure compensation, which is another arrow in our quiver when it comes to that all-important exposure triangle. But I'm going to do another video on exposure compensation and how it ties into what it is we trying to achieve when we use these different modes, or when we're trying to nail our exposure. I want to keep this video short, and like I said, I want to keep it relatively basic for somebody just starting out their journey, getting used to these modes and trying to get out of auto mode. It's a good idea to venture into these other modes first, either aperture priority or program mode or shutter priority. Play around with those before you venture into manual mode. Anyway, guys, I'm going to wrap it up there. As the name of the channel implies, Aperture to Zoom, we're going to cover in its entirety all the different concepts around photography and videography from aperture to zoom. Bit by bit, small videos. A lot of it's going to be quite elementary in the beginning because I make no apologies for being a beginner myself, and I'm learning a lot of these concepts and then sharing them in videos as I go along. So if that sort of resonates with you, don't hesitate to hit the old like button, subscribe if you got some use out of the video, comment if you're stuck in a particular mode, if you're a beginner and you found this information helpful. Let us know what mode you prefer staying in and prefer shooting in, and if there's anything else you thought I missed in the video that would be beneficial, please feel free to add it in the comments below. Thanks for stopping by. Thanks for checking out this video. It is much appreciated. Thank you for the likes and the subscribes. I do appreciate it. And more so, thank you for the comments, taking time out. And we will no doubt catch up in the next one. Over and out.